Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait just another minute for the last people to trickle in, and then we'll be beginning very shortly. So welcome, everyone. It is wonderful to see a very large audience streaming in here. So thank you all for coming. I know this is an urgent topic that is at the top of many people's agendas, and especially in the last couple of days, although it's hard to see things more urgent than they already are urgent. Anyway, I think we're going to be hearing a really interesting discussion tonight. My name is Avi Chomsky. I'm professor of history at Salem State University and a steering committee member of the Committee for the Sane U.S. China Policy. So I will be moderating. I'm going to introduce the speakers. And then I have two questions that I'm going to pose to our three panelists. And they will have 5 minutes to answer each question. And then after they've all had a chance to answer the two questions, I'm going to give them a couple of minutes to give any response that they want to give. And after that, most of our time together tonight will be open to questions from the audience. So the chat has been disabled, but if you have a question, you can post it in the Q&A. So feel free to do that at any time, and we'll be reading over the questions and hopefully getting to pose as many as possible to the speakers. So tonight's event is titled The Ukraine War, Russia, China, and the United States. It's sponsored by the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, Massachusetts Peace Action, and the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy. We have three very knowledgeable panelists here to speak with us tonight. John Feffer, who is Director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. He is also an Open Society Fellow studying Eastern European transformations since 1989. And he is also an acclaimed author of both fiction and nonfiction, including Right Across the World, Splinterlands, Frostlands, and Songlands trilogy. We also have Michael Klare, who is Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at the Five College Program in Peace and World Security Studies out in Western Massachusetts. He is also disarmament correspondent and on the editorial board of The Nation magazine and on the board of the Arms Control Association and is co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy. And finally, last but not least, we have Rajan Menon, Director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. He is also the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Chair Emeritus of International Relations at the Powell School, City University of New York. and he is Senior Research Scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. And he also is just recently returned from a visit to Ukraine. So we'll have some firsthand things to share with us, I'm sure. So the first of my two questions for all three panelists, and I'll ask you to go in the same order, that is beginning with John, and to try to speak for 5 minutes. So the first question is, how do you think Chinese leaders are interpreting what's happening in Ukraine as it affects China, Taiwan, and future U.S.-China relations? So I'm going to be keeping strict time for you. John, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, thank you, Avi, for the kind introduction and for all the co-sponsors for inviting me to this event. This is, of course, a complicated question because we don't have a lot of access to what Chinese leadership is thinking. Sometimes we have to judge from public statements, from statements coming from military bloggers or people close to the party. But to put it briefly, it seems that Chinese leadership is not very happy with what's going on in Ukraine, not happy with Russian actions. There have been public statements, of course, by Xi, by other members of the ruling elite, statements basically saying that they would like to see some kind of negotiated settlement, and they're not happy with the unpredictability, shall we say, of Russian actions. If you put yourself in the shoes of someone in Beijing today, on one side they have an unpredictable nuclear power in the form of North Korea, and now they have another unpredictable nuclear power in the form of Russia. And that's a very uncomfortable position for the Chinese leadership to be in. Obviously, priority for Chinese leadership is economic growth. Anything that compromises economic growth or the territorial integrity of China is obviously something to be avoided. Now, of course, China has a formal relationship with Russia. It has not condemned Russian invasion of Ukraine, but clearly it is uncomfortable with how Russia has been acting. How this affects its relationship with the United States? Well, obviously, China has decided to largely adhere to the sanctions policy, the international sanctions that much of the global North has observed against Russia. And it has basically forced Russia to go to other places to get its technology, its high technology, and its military, the necessary military hardware that it wants, places like Iran and North Korea. And that's something that I think Russia did not anticipate. I think Russia expected that China would be a stronger partner after the invasion. And as a result, they are, well, I mean, we saw, for instance, after the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, some sharply worded comments from both Xi and from Narendra Modi. Shortly after that, Russia engaged in its partial mobilization. And I think that was a clear sign that it wasn't getting what it needed from its partners. On the Chinese side, I think it's important for them to preserve a relationship with the United States and, of course, their relationship with the global economy. And that's why they're adhering to the sanctions largely. And I don't think they want to jeopardize that relationship, even if they have built up their own kind of independent financial apparatus. They have their Belt and Road Initiative, of course, but they still need a cooperative relationship, both with the United States and the global North. I'll let both Michael and Rajan weigh in on the Taiwan situation, and I'll just wrap up here.
Great, thank you. Michael, do you want to hear the question again, or are you all set? You're muted, unmute. Michael, you must unmute.
Sorry, I'm now well aware that 5 minutes goes by quickly, so I'll do my best. So I'm going to begin with an observation that is that before the war, the strategic outlook of China, of the leadership, was largely governed by the same distorted outlook as Vladimir Putin. That is, both were of the belief, also popular in some leftist circles in the United States, that the US dominated unipolar world is gradually but irreversibly losing ground to a multipolar world led by a loose coalition of China, Russia, India, South Africa, and some other developing countries. This outlook, widely popular among nationalist pundits and officials in Russia and China before July 2021, went into overdrive went into overdrive after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. The US withdrawal among this crowd was viewed as a massive setback, as incontrovertible evidence of US decline and retreat and Western disarray. For those who knew better, it was anything but. It was evidence of a reinvigorated US military determined to abandon the lost cause of counterterrorism for the far more appealing option of fighting and crushing the Russian and Chinese military. From then on, they could forget about debilitating counterterror operations and concentrate on what they call great power competition, or high-end warfare against well-armed adversaries, operations they're optimally designed to win. Chinese and Russian strategists didn't see this. They went on believing in the US in retreat mantra. This, I believe, was Putin's fatal mistake. He believed his own propaganda that Russia was vital and all-powerful and the West was weak and decadent. China's critical mistake was to believe both the West in decline mantra and Russia's delusional assessment of the potential Ukrainian battlefield. In this, both ignored the lessons of classic Marxist-Leninist strategic thought, that every move you make should be governed by a scientific analysis of what they call the correlation of forces. That is a combination of material and immaterial capabilities. The number of tanks on one hand, troop morale, leadership potential, national solidarity, allied support on the other. In this respect, Putin got it all wrong. He saw Russian superiority in numbers and failed to calculate Ukrainian superiority in troop morale, officer leadership, national solidarity, and allied support. And this, in the end, will be his undoing. But China also miscalculated by overestimating Russia's military capabilities, underestimating Western solidarity, and Russia's and Ukraine's ability to resist. If I were President Xi, I would fire my entire national security team for such egregious errors. So how does that bear on US-China relations today? If I were in the upper echelons of the Chinese leadership, I'd be screaming for a new, more scientific analysis of the correlation of forces, one that's not distorted by the delusions of the past. And it would begin by recalculating the power balance between the US and its allies on one side, and China and its allies on the other. And it would look much more pessimistic in my eyes than it did before Russia invaded Ukraine. And it would call for a recalculation of China's policies. But I'll say more about that in the next round.
Beautiful, thank you. Rajan, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Avi. It's good to be here with Michael, whom I've known for, I won't even tell people how long Michael's been, many decades. And John, good to be with you. A couple of quick points. I think it's important to understand that the Chinese position on the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been much more nuanced than is generally thought. Despite the talk of a limitless friendship, in 2014, when the Russians annexed Crimea, the Chinese did not recognize that annexation, nor did they recognize the so-called People's Republics, the two statelets that Russia established in the Donbass region, consisting of Lugansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine on Russia's border. That's point number one. Point number two is, I think Xi Jinping, like the rest of us, is absolutely flabbergasted and astonished by what has happened, because it is a case of a country that has vast superiority in everything that we use to measure military power being given more than a run for its money by a much weaker state. I don't think he expected that. He doesn't see a quick end to the war. And I think if there's one thing that Xi does not like is to embrace failure. This was apparent, as John, I think, mentioned at the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, where Putin himself said, I understand that you, the Chinese, have some concerns. So clearly, out of public sight, Xi voiced his concerns. Final point on Taiwan. I think one thing that the Chinese may be wondering is, what lessons will the United States learn from this? Assume for a moment that Western policy led by the U.S. succeeds and Russia is forced to retreat to the February 24th lines. I'm not saying that will happen, but let's postulate that that will happen. The Chinese, I think, are concerned that the Americans will learn that pushing democracy and refusing to accept spheres of influence of other great powers works across the board, and they should apply the same lesson to China. That will take, I think, the United States and China down a very dangerous road. So let me leave it at that.
All right. Thank you all very much. So you ready for question number two? It's kind of a parallel to question number one. How do you think U.S. leaders are interpreting what's happening in Ukraine as it affects China, Taiwan, and the future of U.S.-China relations? So let's begin again with John.
Well, obviously, we have a little bit more access to the thinking of US leaders, but maybe not that much more. So this might also be speculation in terms of the thoughts circulating in Joe Biden's head. But I would say that obviously the United States has come to the aid of Ukraine, and it has expected China to observe the sanctions, which they largely have. And so the Biden administration has been both, I think, congratulatory toward China on that point, but also has issued warnings that China should, not change its policy. So that has been kind of the formal, U.S. response, and the emphasis again is on maintaining some kind of coherence and cohesion in the front against Russia. Now, of course, what is happening behind the scenes is, China continues to buy a lot of energy from Russia. It continues to invest in a lot of energy infrastructure in Russia. There is a general kind of evolution of Russian energy infrastructure moving away from its markets in Europe and towards Asia, and it's something that had preceded the war in Ukraine and is obviously accelerating as a result of the decline of the European market for Russian energy imports. And that, of course, is in some sense a lifeline. Russia has made an enormous amount of money in its energy sales, although it is selling at discounted rates. So it's not necessarily making a huge amount of profits, although it is bringing in a lot of revenue that it is using, obviously, to sustain the war effort. I think in terms of opportunities, unfortunately, from my point of view, the United States hasn't seized on this opportunity to really move closer to China in an effort to, in a classic kind of Nixon-Kissinger pivot, to drive a stronger wedge between Moscow and Beijing, if such a wedge is possible. I'm not sure that such a wedge is possible, but of course it would be useful to test the waters. Obviously, as we all have said, The leadership in Beijing is uncomfortable with what has happened in Ukraine. There has been talk of, within China itself, of Russia as a weak goose. This is popular on the chat that goes on within China, more officially, of yoking China to a second-rate military power. This is not something that is in the long-term interest of China. This is something, of course, the Biden administration could exploit by making a play for greater cooperation with China, reducing, obviously, tariffs, moving further ahead and forward with energy cooperation, et cetera. So far, the United States has not seized that opportunity, though, of course, it could still be an option in the near to midterm future. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So next will be Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I agree with Rajan Menon that this is a very dangerous moment, and it revolves around Taiwan and how China and the U.S. interpret Ukraine's, the meaning of Ukraine for Taiwan. And let me try to explain that. I think as Rajan suggested, there's a danger here that the U.S. is going to see in Ukraine evidence of the superiority of the West, and to view this as incentive to be even tougher against China. That if we could prevail against Russia, and that if Western support and Western weaponry combined with Ukrainian bravery can defeat Russia, the same thing could be done in Asia. That Western weapons, Western solidarity, and Taiwanese bravery can be used to prevent any kind of Chinese takeover of Taiwan. And so I think there's going to be a drive to bring Taiwan into the U.S. Defense Alliance eventually, as the way Japan and South Korea are, and to militarize Taiwan, and to take it forever out of the reach of China. I think that is the current view in Washington, and I think there's a belief that Ukraine shows this, that invading a country where opposition is determined is very difficult. And so I think the US is determined to arm Taiwan to make it increasingly difficult for China to ever use force to take on Taiwan. And this is going to be the political future of foreign policy in the coming years. The Republicans say if they take over the House and Senate, this will be their #1 foreign policy intent. So from China's point of view, this is exceedingly threatening, because they see or they fear there's a danger that Taiwan is slipping out of their grasp, and that the farther into the future you look, the harder it will be for them to bring Taiwan, to reunite Taiwan with the motherland. So there may be pressures on the leadership to act sooner rather than later if it's ever going to use military force. So I think this is an exceedingly dangerous moment, as Rajan suggested, and we're going to have to do everything we can, I believe, to try to prevent these forces from gathering even more momentum. There's legislation in Congress, the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022, which effectively would grant US, de facto recognition of Taiwan as an allied state, which for China is a red line. So we're on the verge of this dangerous moment. So from the US point of view, the Ukraine war shows that fighting China is possible, and we should gear up for that. And as I say, I think this is exceedingly dangerous and has to be resisted as much as we possibly can. I'll stop there.
Okay, excellent. And Rajan.
So Avi, I took your question to mean, what does the Biden administration think the Chinese are concluding from this war? And the answer is that I haven't the faintest idea because I'm not privy to their thinking, but let me tell you what I think are the lessons they would like the Chinese to learn. And there are three. One is the perennial American obsession with credibility. It's bipartisan, it exists across administrations. But they would like the Chinese to draw from this the conclusion that the United States, if it has a close relationship with a country and that country is attacked, it will stand by it if necessary by indirect military intervention, perhaps even leading ultimately to direct military intervention. Obviously, the lesson is apropos Taiwan. The second is they would like the Chinese to understand that the United States can rally the rest of the Atlantic Alliance and others together, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and others, and inflict in short order very devastating punishment on a foe because of the enormous economic leverage it has at its disposal, not least the US dollar. And thirdly, I think it would like the Chinese to take a good hard look at how some American weaponry is performing on the battlefield and draw appropriate conclusions.
Okay, thank you. Would the three panelists like to take one moment to comment on what the others have said and what they've heard? You're each allowed 3 minutes to do that, but I'll leave that up to you if you'd like to do that or to move directly into the questions. John, do you want to take the last 3 minutes to respond?
I'll just say very briefly that I agree that it's a dangerous situation with respect to U.S. China relations and especially the possibility of conflict in Taiwan Strait. But this is a dangerous situation that has been building for some time. I mean, this precedes obviously the invasion of Ukraine. We've had a real shift in the consensus in Washington away from, a division between, those who supported engagement and those who opposed engagement, to a real unfortunate bipartisan consensus that is in favor of much stronger containment and even pushback against China. I don't think that is irreversible. And it's true that the United States is sending signals, as Rajan said, about its determination, its strength, its willingness to deter. But I do think there are opportunities for the United States and China to continue to cooperate, and that those are the things in some sense we should focus on, in addition to trying, of course, to reduce US military spending, military footprint overseas, military exercises, et cetera. But alongside that, keep open the channels for cooperation on clean energy, cooperation on pandemics, et cetera.
Avi, very quickly, if I might, because I didn't want to exceed your time limit the last time around. I think that one of the things that dismays China about what's going on, namely Russia's pathetic military performance, and it can't be called anything else, is not some sentimental love for Russia. The Chinese are utterly non-sentimental. I think a robust and strong Russia is in their interest because it ties up American strategic assets and attention on the Western flank. Now that Russia has in effect shown that it is not a great military power, the Chinese worry is that the United States will devote less and less time to Europe on the theory that the Europeans can now handle the Russian threat, which is not manageable, and swing even more than it was going to toward the Asia Pacific. That is something the Chinese obviously don't want to have happen.
Okay, thank you. Michael, do you have any comment you want to make right now?
Well, I'd just point out that, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is having its 5-year meeting beginning Sunday. And it'll be very interesting to see Xi Jinping will speak, I believe, on Sunday and give a major address. It's likely that he will be reappointed for another 5-year term. It'll be very interesting to see if he comments on any of this. I'll be very interested to see what he says about Taiwan, whether his language will be consistent with the very tough language he's employed over the past few months. If you play with fire, you'll be burned by fire, he told Mr. Biden in their last conversation. Very tough warnings of intent to use force if necessary, or whether there'll be more of an emphasis on domestic development and reviving China's economy, and maybe playing down foreign, or I shouldn't say foreign, Taiwan is not foreign to them, but playing down military risks that would be a distraction. So in my mind, this will be very interesting. I think that the Ukraine conflict also exposes the internal weaknesses in Russia. Putin has been able to suppress them to a considerable extent, but it's clear that his grip is weakening, is deteriorating, or at least I think so, from the mass desertions of the brightest and best of this young population to flee the country. This has to also be on the mind of Chinese leaders. And so we'll have to see if there's a greater focus on domestic development or more of a focus on nationalism and combating the West. So we should be watching.
Okay, thank you. So we have a lot of really good questions coming in. So I would like to ask the panelists, I don't want to muzzle you, but I do want to leave time for as many questions as possible. So if possible, let's try to prioritize one person to answer each question. But if somebody else really wants to chime in, feel free to just be judicious. So I'm going to start with, it's actually, it was a question and then some things were added on to it. So I'm going to give you the additions as well as the question. David Keppel asked, is there evidence that the Biden administration is blocking a negotiated settlement that the Ukrainian government would like to pursue with Russia? If not, should the US be pressing Zelensky to make compromises he may be resisting? And Michael Goldstein adds to that, is there evidence that Boris Johnson and Lloyd Austin used their April trips to Ukraine to pressure Zelensky to pull out of negotiations, as Noam Chomsky and Medya Benjamin have asserted? And David Keppel adds on again, if Michael Goldstein's comment about Noam Chomsky, Boris Johnson is correct about what happened in April, what is the case now? To me, Zelensky seems highly nationalist, maximalist, and provocative.
There is not a shred of evidence that I know of to back up this crazy hypothesis that Zelensky wanted to compromise and that the Biden administration prevented it. I can assure you, based on multiple conversations that I've had, that the Ukrainians actually get rather annoyed at the idea of a compromise, because from their perspective, about 18 or 22%, depending on how you define the occupied territories, is under Russian occupation. Putin has shown no willingness whatsoever to yield any of that territory. To the contrary, he has now annexed it to the Russian Federation, and in his mind, juridically, they are part of the Russian Federation. So the question is, what is he prepared to give as a peace settlement that Ukraine can live with if, in fact, he says, now all these territories are mine? So no, there's no evidence that there was any attempt to coerce Zelensky into not compromising, whereas he wanted to compromise. And secondly, I think the chances of any compromise settlement are now next to zero, which is not something I say happily, by the way.
You guys okay with that answer, John, Michael?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm very glad that Rajan said that. No evidence that I've seen at all. And the notion that Zelensky is maximalist, you know, the bottom line is his country was invaded. He would like, of course, to restore the territory that was taken after the invasion. Perhaps you would consider maximalist as a desire on the part of some Ukrainians to get back territory that was seized prior to the invasion, namely Crimea and parts of the Donbass. But honestly, you know, again, Ukraine was illegally occupied. And so to call those positions maximalist, I think is unfair. The question really, I think, will be determined by the course of the war and whether Ukraine is able to mount another counteroffensive at some point in an attempt to re-seize or seize back that territory that they lost on earlier occasions.
Okay. We have a question from Donald Smith, who asks, can China afford to allow the United States to crush Russia, knowing that China is next in line?
I took the last one first, so I'll let one of my colleagues go.
I don't think that's a valid question. I think China would prefer that Russia survive, and Russia survive with some military capacity, but I don't think that China is in a position to save Russia. I think the risk of overextending itself to support Russia outweighs, you know, the losses that it would take if it didn't act. Putin is now, I think, a loose cannon and a lost cause. So I think for China to embrace Putin closer puts them in great danger. When I say loose cannon, for example, he's threatening to use nuclear weapons. Now, I personally think the likelihood of that is low, but it's increasing by the day. I don't think that it's high yet, but it is increasing. And how could China embrace a country that uses nuclear weapons, which probably would kill many civilians and spread radiation all over the place? I don't see how China could do that and turn and face the people it wants to rally in Asia and Africa, in the developing world, you know, to look to Beijing for leadership if its allies are throwing nuclear weapons around.
So, Michael, your response brings us to another question by Donald Smith, which is, what are the chances that Russia will resort to tactical nuclear weapons if backed into a corner?
Yeah, well, I think they're low. At this point, I think they're low. At this point, they're low. I think Putin has shown his favored tactic of retaliation, which is to inflict maximal pain on the civilian population in Ukraine by destroying housing, infrastructure, heating and electricity, to make life miserable and deadly for the civilian population in Ukraine, in the hope that the Ukrainians will lose their hunger for continuing the war and willing to settle for terms that Zelensky will be forced to settle. I don't think there's any likelihood that that will happen. I think that's a futile wish, but I think that's his preferred strategy. He has the capacity to do that, to inflict vast pain through attacks on civilian infrastructure. I think that the risk of using nuclear weapons, the cost he would pay is too high. That could change And that's what I'm so frightened about what's happening, because now in response to these last round of attacks, I think there'll be pressure on the US and on NATO to supply Ukraine with even more powerful weapons. If they start striking within Russia, then the pressure on Putin to escalate further will grow. And at that point, then I'm not prepared to say the risk of use of nuclear weapons is low. But at this point, I'm hopeful it remains low.
Avi, can I take a crack at the two questions that were asked by the same person?
Yes, absolutely.
First, on what can China do to help Russia? The answer is nothing, because if you, in a literal sense, if you look at the strategic center of gravity of each country, China's is on its eastern seaboard in the east and southeast. Russia's is on the west. If you look at the map, you will find that there's a great geographical difficulty in taking Chinese strategic assets from where they're located in strong measure and pivoting to the west, either by sea or by land. So in a military sense, it cannot do anything. In an economic sense, it has no incentive whatsoever to help Russia out by sanctions busting, because the Chinese, above all, are committed to maintaining the maximum level of economic growth, and they're not in a very good position either. Escalation, I would say if anybody tells you there's 10, 20, 30% probability of escalation, reach for your wallet, don't believe them, because this is a parlor game that's played now. I don't know, nobody knows, because we have no evidence. All we can do is use deductive logic and think that we're Putin and think through various moves he may or may not make. But the fallacy there is that you can very easily project your deductive principles onto the adversary, whereas the adversary may be thinking something very different. There is, however, a paradox involved here, and that is the more US policy succeeds in Ukraine, that is, the better Ukraine does on the battlefield, the greater the risk of escalation.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift gears for a moment here, because Elizabeth Fatah asks a question. Is anyone thinking about global climate change?
Well, sure.
I can take a first crack at that. I mean, interestingly, we did see some movement in Russia on decarbonization plans prior to the invasion. In the lead up to the last COP, Putin said, pledged that Russia would meet carbon neutrality by 2060, that there was some movement even at a provincial level in Russia to start thinking about clean energy. For the most part, Russia is behind pretty much every industrialized country in terms of its commitment to renewable energies, solar, wind, et cetera. It is a petro state. It has invested in gas and oil and coal above all. But alas, as a result of the invasion, whatever small progress Russia had made toward decarbonization has basically gone out the window. And so it has doubled down essentially on its petro-state nature. China, of course, has invested a tremendous amount into renewables and saw last year an incredible increase in the amount of solar and wind capacity added in terms of electricity generation. Of course, the overall energy needs of China grew as well. So in fact, you didn't see any actual change in the reduction in dependency on fossil fuels, gas, oil, and coal inside China. However, China has made much more ambitious pledges about reducing its dependency on those fossil fuels. And if anything, we will probably see an increase in those, according to the people I've talked to in China who monitor those issues. We'll see an increase in that determination, not simply by the national government, but at a provincial level, in which you have some provinces much further ahead than Beijing and the federal policy, and some provinces behind. But those kind of best case scenario provinces are actually pushing Chinese policy in that direction in an accelerated fashion.
Yeah, I'd like to add something, if I may. And that is, things all come back to Taiwan is in so many ways, and climate change is now falling victim to the U.S. obsession with Taiwan. That's my reading here. The Biden administration came in with a policy that we're going to have a competitive relationship with China. We're going to compete with them. We're going to challenge them on a lot of issues. But at the same time, we're going to cooperate in areas where there's mutual interest, climate change being the number one of those, pandemic relief another. But climate change was at the top of the list. And our former Senator John Kerry was sent to China, and there was some promising conversations about U.S. Chinese cooperation in this area. But then when Pelosi announced her trip to Taiwan, the Chinese said, forget it. We're not going to talk. If you're going to cross our red line, and Taiwan is our red line, if you're going to humiliate us in this fashion, if you're going to ignore what we're telling you is so critical to us, which is Taiwan, if you're going to mistreat us this way, we're not going to talk to you about climate change. We're not going to talk to you about anything cooperatively. Now, I'm not defending the Chinese for taking that maximalist position, but this is climate cooperation has fallen victim to the U.S. drive to deny Taiwan to China. And so progress on climate change on the world stage is doomed as long as U.S.-China hostility prevails, which is why our committee says that we have to reverse the priorities and make cooperation on climate change the leading edge of U.S.-China policy, not the tail end.
So the question was, does anybody think about climate change? And the answer is, I do, and I think about it all the time. Before I began thinking about it, I had no gray hair, and now I have plenty. But on a more serious note, I think getting control of climate change is hard enough in a world of 100+ states without any central coordinating body to organize collective action. So it's inherently very difficult. But if you take into account now that we have to layer on top of that almost an irrevocable break between Russia and the West, increasing tension between the United States and Europe on the one hand and China on the other, this does not bode well for climate change. There's on one final point, I think my generation should hang its head in shame because we've utterly failed generations to come. I mean, I just became a grandfather not long ago, and I think about, well, what kind of world will my grandson inherit? And we've done a terrible job. I mean, we have not, in the United States or any country for that matter, integrated climate change as part of our integral thinking on national security. We have a militarized conception of national security that completely seems to screen climate change out as some ecological or economic problem, for reasons that I find really perplexing.
And I'm just going to abuse my position as moderator here to add something, which is that I feel like this war has caused the biggest per capita consumers in the world, which is the United States and Europe, to double down on fossil fuel production and investments in future fossil fuel production.
I don't think it's quite as bad as that. In Europe, they're in response to the invasion by Russian invasion and the sanctions and Russia's counterattack on the energy front, Europe is moving partly to resurrect fossil fuels, but there's going to be a lot more faster progress towards renewables in Europe as a consequence. So that's one small silver lining in all of this.
Okay, we have a question from Cole Harrison. The Ukraine war demonstrates the incapacity of the Russian military. Does it also demonstrate substantial effectiveness of the U.S. military in conventional combat? showing strengths in high-tech areas such as intelligence? And if so, should we reassess the U.S. Chinese military balance?
Well, I said that earlier in my remarks, so the answer is yes to his question. I think there's no question that the military gear that the US is supplying to Ukraine is superior to most of what the Russians are fielding. And I think the Chinese are noting that very, very closely. And this goes back to the fact that the Russians, their arms industry is just not as advanced as was thought by Putin for sure, and the Chinese as well, but also a product of the deep-seated corruption in Russia, because a lot of money was voted by the Duma for the modernization of the arms industry, and clearly that wasn't spent on arms modernization. It went somewhere else. But also the fact that, as John said earlier, Russia's a petrostate, and Putin and company did not invest in building up a Silicon Valley the way you need to today. China has, but not Russia. And so they were dependent on Western chips and other Western technology much more than was previously thought. And if you cut that off, their equipment is inferior. And I'm sure the Chinese military are watching this eagle-eyed and taking lessons from it.
John, do you want to add something? I was going to jump in very quickly, but you haven't had a chance to speak, so why don't I?
No, go ahead. I'll take the next question.
I'll just say it in 2 sentences. I think to conclude anything about the U.S.-China military balance based on the performance of the Russian military vis-a-vis American weaponry would be a categorical mistake. It is a different customer altogether. And in fact, one of my concerns has been that we will draw, if the gambit here succeeds and Ukraine prevails, possibly the wrong lesson in terms of our China policy.
I'm not sure I understand what you just said, Rajan. If you could, I mean, I think if I were Chinese leaders looking at it's not just the weaponry, it's how you use the weaponry. And
the questioner, correct me if I'm wrong, Avi, but I think the questioner said, we see something going on the battlefield in Ukraine with respect to Russian performance. Does that imply anything for the U.S.-China military balance? And I'm saying not necessarily, because I think to say, well, the Russians are not faring well against American weaponry, therefore China won't either, assumes that Russian military capabilities are Chinese military capabilities. And I think the Chinese are much more advanced. That's not to say that we are militarily inferior to the Chinese. And I hope we don't ever get to find out and put that proposition to test.
Yes. I will say this, the Ukrainian military, like the American military, has real combat experience, and the Chinese military does not. And I think that, and they haven't used their weapons in war. So if I were a Chinese general, I would be very nervous to go into battle against the American military.
So let me ask a question by Ernie Rosado. Is it true that Chinese leaders are losing their ability to keep the media under firm control? If so, then are they losing one of their most powerful tools in maintaining power, a foreboding prospect for a country historically prone to fragmentation? Do you think China will again fragment?
I'll take a first crack at that. Of course, I wrote a novel that looked at what the situation would be in 2050, and it imagined that China would split along with most of the other major countries in the world. But that was a novel. So let me talk about what I think in the next few years. I don't see a lot of evidence that China has lost control of the media. Of course, there is a lot of a more decentralized media landscape in China than, say, 5 or 10 years ago, in which you have a lot of bloggers participating with large followings. And for instance, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, generally speaking, the blogosphere in China was supportive of Russia. They saw this as an effort to really decrease U.S. power in the world. And Russia's seizure of Ukraine, which they imagined would happen rather quickly, would be, as Rajan said and Michael implied, a kind of restructuring of the correlation of forces geopolitically. But as Russian military has suffered one defeat after another, the blogosphere has responded in a very different way and has even ridiculing some of the quote unquote experts that predicted an easy Russian victory at the beginning of the war. I think in general, the Chinese Communist Party has been very skillful in maintaining a certain cohesion in the media sphere around messages of nationalism, not around necessarily communist ideology, but about nationalism and the importance of the Chinese state and the Chinese people. I don't see that changing necessarily in the short term. But of course, as you say, history is not kind to China as an entity. And there are any number of reasons why China could split apart. And I'm not thinking so much of the traditional ones, Xinjiang or kind of splitism in terms of regionalism. I'm thinking about what would happen if the Chinese economic engine were to sputter, and the promises that the Chinese Communist Party has made, both implicitly and explicitly to the Chinese people, that they will continuously enjoy improvements in their standard of living, would come to an end. And that would jeopardize both the position of the Chinese Communist Party within society, but it might also lead to greater and larger divisions within the society as a whole.
I might add something, unless Rajan, you wish to say something, but I want to follow up with something you said, which was about the importance of climate change. And that is that China is very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, perhaps more so than any other major power, because of its exposure on one hand to the Pacific Ocean and on one side, and to desert on the other side, which Rajan spoke about. Its west is desert, and the desert is expanding, and its coastal areas are exposed to sea level rise and extreme storms. And this summer, it didn't get very much attention in the Western media, but China suffered incredible heat waves and droughts and floods. The economy of southern China was paralyzed for weeks on end because of no water power. And flooding, and then extreme drought. The Yangtze River was unnavigable for weeks at a time. This is going to be China's future, and this is the sort of thing in the history of China that brought down dynasties, and it's going to accelerate in the future. This is why the U.S. and China have to cooperate on climate change.
Okay, there's a question from Jeff Abramson. I think the real challenge in the American context is to convince the public and policymakers that there is a non-military approach that will result in good outcomes for Ukraine and Taiwan. Can the panelists provide recommendations on how they would approach the Ukraine war and Taiwan's status security in a way that is supported by evidence and or likely to be seen as viable?
Well, if somebody has a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine, they deserve a Nobel Prize and they should let me know what the solution is because I've been thinking about this a lot and maybe I'm just limited, but I don't really see it, frankly. I mean, let's look at the facts. Recently, on the basis of a completely bogus referendum, in which surprisingly just about everybody voted to join Russia, Putin declared that these four provinces of Ukraine, which the Russian military, by the way, does not totally control in some instances, are not part of the Russian Federation. So if there's to be a compromise, he will be put in a position of having to cede Russian territory as he has defined it to Ukraine. I don't think he's about to do that. I don't think the Ukrainians, having bled and suffered, and now having gained the momentum, are of a mind to stop short of anything at minimum that does not get the Russians back to the February 24th line. I'm not saying that that's necessarily feasible, but that's their mindset. So I don't really see, as much as I'd like to see this war come to an end, I think it's important here to have moral clarity on who attacked whom. I mean, there are people on the left that kind of mystify me. They oppose the Iraq war because it was a preventive war, regime change, as I did as well. I think this is every bit the same thing. It's a preventive war, regime change. Let's not forget that in 1991, the Russians recognized Ukraine in its existing boundaries. In 1994, as a result of the Budapest Memorandum that was signed after Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, it did so again. So there has to be some clarity here about who's doing what to whom. So when we speak of compromise, it's essentially as if I come into your house, Avi, and I take most of your most valued possessions, and somebody comes and says, well, there ought to be a diplomatic compromise where I get to keep some and you get to keep a little bit, or I get to keep everything and you get some tidbit. I mean, that's essentially how the Ukrainians interpret calls for diplomatic settlement. In the abstract, it's very nice. Well, concretely, how will it work out?
Yeah, I would just add, I completely agree with Rajan's assessment. I think maybe what Jeff is asking is, what are some of the parameters for a diplomatic compromise, even if one is not in the offing this week or next? Perhaps he has in mind, for instance, in addition to kind of territorial compromises, what would be the status of Ukraine in terms of neutrality and whether it can forego membership in NATO. Unfortunately, I would agree again with Rajan that the more the war progresses, and as he said, the more successful Ukraine is, the more difficult, frankly, it is to achieve any of these compromises that were discussed earlier in the war. It's only through exhaustion on the battlefield and a failure by both sides to achieve military objectives that we can kind of begin talking about the diplomatic parameters of an agreement.
So can I just push the question a little bit further, because I don't actually think that the question was asking about the parameters of a diplomatic solution. I think that the question was focusing on is military escalation the only constructive policy that the United States can take right now? Is there a non-military approach that the United States can take that will result in good outcomes for Ukraine and Taiwan? That is, this is about Taiwan as well as Ukraine, the question.
Well, first of all, there is the question of what kind of weapons that the U.S. supplies to Ukraine. And I support what the Biden administration has done so far, which is to place limits on what it supplies that try to avoid extreme escalatory responses by Russia. Try to avoid that, to set limits on what would be supplied to try to reduce the pace of escalation. Now, I fear that we're all going to lose control over the pace of escalation as the war proceeds, and the kind of strikes we've seen in the past week are going to multiply on both sides. attacks on infrastructure in Russia or Russian claimed territory and in Ukraine. So I'm terrified by what we might see. But one thing what the U.S. could do is to try to moderate what's being supplied to Ukraine so that it doesn't lead to a war other than between Ukraine and Russia, which I think that is a priority. But I don't think the U.S. could bring the parties together. I think the U.S. has to cede that to other actors and encourage other actors to play that role. And that's a sign of the times, perhaps, that role will have to be played by perhaps Modi of India, perhaps Erdogan of Turkey, and other actors, the Pope for that matter. But it can't. The U.S. is not an honest broker in this, and others will have to step in.
I agree with Michael. I think we've disqualified ourselves in the eyes of Russia because we're seen as a partisan of Ukraine, which we are. I think the Chinese have disqualified themselves in the eyes of the Ukrainians because they are seen as a partisan of China, even though they're becoming somewhat less partisan. If I had to pick a candidate to do this, it would be some combination of the United Nations and Erdogan of Turkey. I think he really wants to do this. He's actually walked a very fine line while supplying some very effective drones to Ukraine, but not completely alienating Russia. He brought the two sides together to enable the freeing up of exports from Ukrainian ports of grain. And so he is the likely candidate. The question is, who is prepared to give up what for peace? And that is where we're stuck. So when I said that I don't see a solution, I didn't mean to bat away the idea that there ought to be a diplomatic solution. I think it would be good to do that. On weapons, let me just say one thing very quickly. There's now a discussion going on about how that bridge was actually brought down. And I have friends who know much more about explosives and so on because they've actually been in combat and know this stuff. So I've been convinced by them that the truck bomb theory is to be ruled out. The Russians would love to present that theory because it makes the Ukrainians look like crazy suicide bombers. But you have to have a huge amount, tons and tons of C4 on a truck to bring it across the bridge. And you've got to assume that somehow the Ukrainian Secret Service was able to do that undetected in Russia and then drive the truck across. The most likely candidate, it turns out, is a missile called the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System. Now, this is something that the Ukrainians have wanted us to give them. It has a much longer range than does the HIMARS. It has about a range of 180 miles. I don't know whether the Ukrainians have this weapon, and this was the weapon that hit the bridge, but the Ukrainians are pushing for this weapon, and it'll be very interesting to see now whether the Biden administration decides in the wake of these recent attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure following the attack on the bridge, whether the ATACMS will be supplied, because that will be a very powerful signal to Russia, and they will not be amused by that.
No, that's a sure prescription for escalation on both sides. So I haven't heard that theory about the ATACMS as the cause. It may be the case. The U.S. has said they've not supplied that to Ukraine, so that would be a clandestine operation if it were the case. There will be pressure on Biden now to supply them in Congress. I hope that he chooses not to do that, to hold back, because if they're used to attack Russia itself, Putin will be forced to retaliate in ways that will lead to many civilian casualties. And I want to say one thing because it hasn't come up in this conversation, and that is that Putin has very successfully silenced his anti-war opposition. Those people are in jail or out of the country or silenced one way or the other. But he's not silenced the pro-war constituency in Russia. And I think this now poses a political threat to him because they're become very critical, if not Putin himself, the people he's appointed to run the war, very outspoken. And I think the attacks that he mounted in the past few days were not driven by any particular response to the West or to Ukraine, but that was a response to internal criticism from his own pro-war right-wing constituency. And I think he's at risk from that part of the population far more than from the anti-war part of the population. And this is something we need to watch. I don't know if John or Rajan has anything to say about it, but they become an actor in all of this because they're pushing Putin to be much more aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen comments by Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, that have been critical of generals in charge of the war, has been pushing the most extreme position, namely the use of nuclear weapons. There have been military bloggers which, have criticized the Russian conduct of the war, not just recently, even before the counteroffensive began to show some success. I'll also add very quickly that we did see potential use of ATACMS earlier. There were some explosions in Crimea that were beyond the range of the HIMARS. And there has been speculation that those too were the result of ATACMS, because it would have required at least double the range of a missile. Probably not supplied clandestinely by the United States, but probably supplied by Europe secretly, but and perhaps with the plausible denial of / approval of the United States. But it's likely that those are already in Ukrainian hands.
Avi, if I could just circle back very quickly to what Michael said. I know you've got questions in the queue, so I'll be quick. Just to give you a sampling of how the elite who support the war have now started excoriating the management of it without criticizing Putin. The chair of the Duma, that's one of the houses of the Russian parliament, Defense Committee, a former general, said, "We have to stop lying about the failures in this war. Our people are not stupid." Somebody else said of the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, a provincial official, senior provincial official in Kherson province, one of the annexed provinces, he said of Sergei Shoigu, who has not served a day in combat, that any real soldier, were he the defense minister today, would take out a gun and shoot himself. So now the war is being criticized not so much from the dissident anti-Putin groups, as Michael pointed out correctly. It is coming from within the inner circle. So far, no one's taking aim at the president, but I think there's a great deal of dissatisfaction over what is nothing other than the humiliation of Russia. And so Putin is in a very, very difficult position. The threats of escalation, the retaliation of his infrastructure after the hitting of the bridge, all these are symptomatic of a man under great pressure. And you don't want to put the president of a nuclear power, the world's only other nuclear superpower, under too much pressure ever.
So let me just push once more the other part of that question, which is, what would a realistic and constructive U.S. policy towards Taiwan be? What should we be fighting for on that account? And I would like to also connect that to a question from Dennis Wong, which is, what would it take for the US and China to be friends? What are some major benefits to a peaceful coexistence?
I have thoughts about that. Do you want to speak, John, first? I've read many Chinese statements about Taiwan over the past year or so, and we post them on our website, saneuschinapolicy.org, and you could scroll down Taiwan and you could read what the Chinese have been saying. And I think that they say over and over again, hey, you Americans, you're not hearing us. You're not grasping that Taiwan is critical for our identity. This is our heart. Our hearts are here. This is fundamental to us. Hear us, listen to us. they say that over and over again, you're ignoring us. And so the way to begin, and I think it's very easy, is to say, okay, we hear you. We understand that Taiwan is important to you. We understand that you feel that there are strong bonds between the mainland and Taiwan. So we have to, we feel differently about where Taiwan should go. We feel that Taiwan has the right of self-determination. We could say that, but we have to show respect for what China feels about this and say, okay, let's get together to talk about this. Is there some way in which all of our core needs can be mutually satisfied? I think that that's possible, but it has to be in an environment of mutual respect. And the United States is not showing that mutual respect to China on this issue. And you just have to look at this, what the US says and what China says, to see the clear difference in language.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Michael says. I mean, I hope that the toothpaste isn't out of the toothpaste tube. In other words, if we can go back to our policy of strategic ambiguity, to our two China principle, and to essentially reduce the number of congressional delegations that go to Taiwan, the number of top officials that go to Taiwan, that of course would be very helpful. In terms of U.S.-China relations, we talk a lot about clean energy cooperation. There were a number of agreements signed during the Obama administration that to a certain extent are still in force, although they're much more quiet these days than they were previously. But one thing that we could do, I'm going to give two possibilities. The first would be to actually participate in the greening the BRI, greening the Belt and Road Initiative. This has been a proposal that's been on the boards that China has to a certain extent accepted, that it's necessary to take its enormous investment, its enormous infrastructure projects around the world and put them on a more sustainable basis. But it's one thing for the United States to simply say, please, we want you to do this. And it's quite another for the United States actually join hands with China as a partner, as a co-financing partner on infrastructure projects. That would be an extraordinarily powerful statement of the importance of the two major economic superpowers cooperating on clean energy in a global sense. My own, and this is the second step, my own personal vision would be U.S.-China cooperation on a regional green initiative, a regional for Northeast Asia. China has long said that it wants to be involved in a much stronger regional kind of security or alternative security structure in Northeast Asia that would include North Korea and of course, Japan, South Korea, possibly Mongolia. But what could be an extremely powerful cooperation between the US and China is to work with both North Korea and South Korea on a kind of green reunification, which the peninsula kind of makes a great leap forward, to use a Chinese expression, a great leap forward, but in a green sense, leapfrogging into green technologies. This is something that actually North Korea can do much more easily than South Korea because it doesn't have the sunk costs or the political opposition of sectoral interests inside North Korea to a green transition. Much of its industrial capacity, of course, deteriorated a great deal during the 1990s. So this longer term cooperative venture between the United States and China around Northeast Asia, I think would be extraordinarily powerful project.
So Rajan, I wanted to turn to you for just a minute because you did just return from Ukraine. Do you want to tell us something about what you feel you learned there?
Well, to use the cliche, I learned yet again, as I did in Afghanistan, that war is hell. The destruction is just unbelievable. If the Russians say that they have not hit residential facilities, schools, malls, hospitals, don't believe them because I've seen all of these structures demolished. So the destruction has been so massive that it will take Ukraine at least a generation with enormous amounts of outside help to reconstitute itself. There's victory in war, if that happens, and then there's victory in reconstruction. And I'm not sure at this point which is going to be the more difficult task. 11 million Ukrainians are either refugees or IDPs. I've been to at least one IDP camp, and people have lost their homes. They've lost the schools in which their kids used to go to school. They've lost the shops in which they used to buy things, and they are completely marooned. So it seems to me that there's a very, very big task ahead in terms of reconstituting Ukraine. The problem that Ukraine faces is the possibility of a significant recession in the West that's long lasting, and then it will have to turn to somebody else for money. And the question is who provides that money. The other thing I will say is that there's a kind of paradox. The more firepower the Russians rain down on Ukraine, the greater the hatred for Russia and the greater the determination to persist. In an ironic sense, when the history of Ukraine is written many years hence, and people ask, well, who are some of the notable figures in helping forge Ukrainian national identity? My guess was Vladimir Putin, much to his surprise, will make that list. I also wouldn't advise many people to go there, by the way. It's extremely dangerous depending on where you want to go. If you're on the western part of Ukraine, it's one thing. If you're in Kiev, it's okay. Although every single day that I was in Kiev, there were air raids. But beyond Kiev, out into the war zones, you're literally taking your life in your hands. It's not something to do on a whim.
And maybe as kind of a follow-up to that, a question from Joseph Gerson. Given Russia's escalation with massive attacks on infrastructure, how much punishment can Ukraine take before it moves to negotiate with Russia and seek a compromise solution?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I mean, I will be quick because I'm speaking out of turn here, Joseph, because I think if the Russians believe that they cannot win the war militarily in any conventional, that is to say, traditional sense, what they will try to do is to destroy systematically as much of the Ukrainian economy as possible: waterworks, dams, factories, the electricity grid, transportation nodes. And it has already begun to do that. They have scaled up in recent weeks the attacks on infrastructure. What you're seeing in recent days is not something entirely new. They've been at this for a long time. So I think their plan B, if you will, is to say, well, if we can't prevail militarily, we will make it impossible for Ukraine to wage the war without economically imploding. Is that cheerful enough for you?
And this one's not necessarily for Rajan, but kind of continues along the same lines. Rick Scheck says, I think the speakers underestimate Russian power and determination. They've been quite restrained in their actions up to now, but can easily increase their efforts, as we see with the recent retaliatory shock and awe attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure. Do the speakers really believe that so-called Western unity will survive a cold winter with food and energy shortages?
Well, I've spoken.
I'll speak to the military part. You know, it's easy to shoot missiles against civilian targets. It's easy. You don't have to have a strong military to do that. That's not a demonstration of power. That's a demonstration of weakness. The test is on the battlefield, and the Russian military is disintegrating before our eyes. They're lost somewhere estimates of 100,000 to 120,000 soldiers killed or wounded. I'm not sure if it's certainly that many casualties. And that's an extraordinarily high number, far exceeds the number of US losses in Iraq and Afghanistan and in all of the recent wars the US has fought. And the numbers of tanks that have been destroyed and armored personnel carriers and other weapons is extraordinary. It will take Russia decades and money that it doesn't have to rebuild that force. So Russia will emerge from this as a has-been military power, except for its nuclear weapons. And that's why we have to be frightened. But as Rajan says, it still has the capacity to destroy apartment buildings and shopping malls and power stations. So people will suffer as a consequence. But that is not a demonstration of military prowess, but of weakness.
To the question, I don't rule out for a moment the capacity of Russia to fight this war and to wreak even more destruction on Ukraine. I don't rule out the possibility, although I don't know anything about the probability of escalation. So I'm with the question on all of that. Where I would disagree with him is in his observation that Russia has been restrained. I mean, I think if you go to Ukraine and look around at the cities that have been devastated, I think you would have a very hard time saying that that is restraint, because it's a very odd definition of restraint. The western part of Ukraine has largely been unscathed, but the east and the south have been devastated. The city of Mariupol deserves to be called the latter-day Guernica. It has just been reduced to the ground. The Russian tactic has been to unleash ferocious volleys of artillery fire, to raise things to the ground, and then send their soldiers in. The irony here is that the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, which are simplistically called Russophone, the whole question of Ukrainian identity is actually much more complicated, and I don't have time to get into that. These are the very areas that have been suffered the most in terms of the war. So I would find the idea of Russia being restrained as a very odd choice of words. I think in terms of conventional military power, they've thrown everything they possibly can at Ukraine. And if they haven't thrown anything more, it speaks to their limitations. Now, could they use a nuclear weapon? Yes, I think it is entirely within the realm of possibility, but that's another story. But I don't think they have fought a war with one hand tied behind their back. They've gone full gear. They just haven't succeeded in defeating the Ukrainian military.
I would agree with that assessment. I mean, the only way you could say that Russia was being restrained is that it hasn't reduced all of Ukraine to what Grozny looked like during the Chechen War, complete devastation throughout the country. The other part of the question is, will Europe buckle as a result of energy pressures? And certainly I think that's something that the Kremlin is hoping for. I mean, Putin has effectively based his strategy on a weakening of the resolve of especially Europeans, but US as well, as a result of elections and as a result of the cost of energy and the cold months ahead. I think there probably will be some reconsideration, but I mean, just look at what happened in Italy. I mean, here you have a very far right-wing government that is forming, a very far right-wing coalition led by Brothers of Italy, which in another time would have obeyed the law of far-right parties in Europe and paid a visit to Moscow to basically be blessed by Vladimir Putin as Liga had done, as Marine Le Pen had done in France. But on the contrary, Brothers of Italy and Giorgia Meloni issued a statement saying, condemning the Russian invasion, saying that it was supporting NATO. Really a surprising turnaround for a far-right party. I think that is more the case going forward, that Putin has lost even his far-right supporters in Europe.
So we are at the end of our hour and a half. And I would like to suggest there's so many great questions that we haven't had a chance to talk about. Would like for us to keep a copy of those questions and hopefully put on our website. Perhaps some of the panelists would be interested in writing something for us that address some of the questions we haven't had a chance to talk about here tonight. But I would like to thank very much all three panelists, everybody who attended, the wonderful questions you posted. I've certainly learned a lot here tonight, and the organizations that sponsored us here. So thank you very much to everybody.
And thank you, Avi, for moderating the panel and keeping us corralled.
Yes, thank you very much, Avi.
Thank you, Avi.